Okay, the last lesson we took a look at the Reformation, so how that humanist and Renaissance movement really spills over and creates a crisis, fracturing the authority of the Catholic Church. Now, in topic 9.5, we're going to see how this Reformation continues to spill out and reverberate and have shock waves across all of Europe. So, the goal here is for you to be able to explain why religious fragmentation increased instability across Europe. So what originally really starts out as Luther not challenging the authority of the church, but essentially saying, "Hey, this is a debate. Here's things we should be discussing, problems that I'm seeing within the faith," and it quickly escalates from that into a challenge to the authority of the church. And these ideas, well, they get written down, copied, and spread thanks to the printing press. And this grows far beyond what the church can control. As you can see here, as it spreads from Wittenberg, where Luther was, and then it's just going in all directions. And you see another Reformation here, the Calvinist movement, the Anglican movement. So there's going to be successive waves of this Reformation. Now you have rulers who are relying on religious faith in order to justify their rule. They have to, in communities who believe in this faith, they gotta choose sides. Are they going to choose a side with Luther and his complaints against the Catholic Church, or are they going to side with the Catholic Church, which they've always known? And this idea of who you side with, it becomes very territorial. So Europe originally kind of united here in the Catholic faith, here in this Orange area. Here, by the time pretty soon after Luther's ideas start to spread, you start to see there's all kinds of different versions of Christianity popping up across Europe. And which version of Christianity you start to follow depends on the region you live in. So the core shift here is religion is no longer universal and the same for everyone across Europe. Religion becomes very political at this point. Where this really starts to explode into violence is, well, let's start in the Holy Roman Empire in the heartland in Germany itself. Reform really starts to hit society. Luther starts teaching that we all have spiritual equality before God, and therefore the Pope is not better than anyone else, the bishops aren't better than anyone else, right? Everyone is equal before the eyes of God. And the peasant class, they hear this and they go, oh, well, then we should apply the same idea of spiritual equality before God to mean everyone here on earth is equal, and we should kind of get rid of these social hierarchies. You can probably see how the nobles and the kings are going to be like, no, that's not okay. But the peasants, they say, no, 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 if we're all equal in the eyes of God, then we should be equal here on earth. So we need to end the heavy taxation. We need to reform serfdom so people are no longer slaves and tied to the land. And the peasants start to revolt. And these revolts quickly spread across the German states. So now the nobles and the kings, they have this real problem on their hands. Luther's got a choice, right? Is he going to side with the peasants who are saying, well, if we're equal in the eyes of God, then we should be all equal here on earth, or at least have more freedom than we currently have? Or are we going to side with the nobles and the kings who are saying, no, 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 you peasants, we need you to do all the work, because what are we going to do? Do the farming and the blacksmithing and all the basic fire? Are we going to do all that ourselves? So Luther's got a choice. Who is he going to pick? Is he going to pick the nobility? Is he going to pick the peasants? So there's real pressure here, right? Religious ideas create this social instability as the people who need to kind of just accept their position in the world and keep their head down and be controlled in order to make sure the food is being grown, make sure the work is getting done. They're starting to call for more equality and more rights. And so Luther's got this choice. Is he going to side with the nobles to preserve order of society, or is he going to support the revolt? And Luther sides with the nobility. The consequence here is that reform starts to align with political elites, not social revolution. So Luther, he's all about reforming religious ideas. He doesn't want to upturn the entire social hierarchy that European life is based on. I should also note that in many of his writings, he's very anti Semitic and blames a lot of problems on Jewish people because, again, people at this time, they're blaming everything on Jewish people. They are the favorite scapegoat of people in Europe. There's a problem, it must be Jewish people causing it. Again, not the case, not in reality, but it's easier than accepting the truth. Which is, the peasants are being taken advantage of and they deserve some equality and some rights. And, maybe this whole religious system where we have a few people who have all the religious power isn't the best way to run things. It's within the Holy Roman Empire, which again is history's greatest joke. It's not holy because there's all kinds of these religious wars as we're seeing break out across the empire. It's not Roman because most of its land is in the former territories of Germania, never conquered by the Romans. And it's not an empire because really it's just a collection of all these tiny little independent, not quite independent, pseudo-independent, pseudo-combined little prince kingdoms that kind of have allegiance to a single emperor, but the emperor has very little power over them. So it's not holy, it's not Roman, it's not an empire. Regardless, it's inside this territory that religion becomes state policy. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at this time, who is I like to call them the incest jaw family. He's a Habsburg, right? And he is devoutly Catholic. He truly, truly believes in the Catholic faith. He is a strong ally of the Catholic Pope, and he decides that he's going to punish people or fight people who are starting to side with Luther's ideas. And so, because many of these princes here, they're starting to see, well, maybe if we can break away from this Catholic Church authority but still remain Christian, we can then weaken the power of the emperor, have some strength and power to ourselves, and the emperor is just not having it. So the German states really start to divide over, are we going to become, are we going to stay Catholic Christian? Are we going to be part of Luther's version of Christianity, known as Lutheranism? Or are we going to follow this third version called Calvinism, which both Catholics and Lutheran Christians don't like? We'll get to them in a minute. But this war basically exhausts both sides, as we now have Christians killing other Christians about not being the right version of Christianity, and it's just, well, plain exhausting. This war eventually leads to what's called the Peace of Augsburg in 1555, and this ends fighting. You need to know about the Peace of Augsburg. Essentially, what happens with the Peace of Augsburg, instead of the emperor saying he gets to decide the religion for everyone within his empire, he says, all right, each of these different colored areas is a different territory controlled by a different prince, right? And so you see these kind of borders right here. And inside these territories, the Peace of Augsburg says each prince in these local territories can choose the religion of the territory for themselves. This doesn't mean the people who live there get to choose their religion. It means the prince in control of that territory gets to decide your religion for you, and they can choose between Catholicism or Lutheranism. Of course, some are like, well, about Calvinism, this other version. And the Catholics and the Lutherans are like, no, shut up, you can't be that version of Christianity because, well, it's exhausting. Christians hating Christians for being the wrong type of being a Christian. Frankly, it's exhausting. But the Peace of Augsburg really does show this real structural shift. Religious unity in Europe is over. Authority shifts from the Pope to territorial rulers, right? It now depends. The version of Christianity you follow in Western Europe depends on what the ruler who controls that territory believes the religion should be. So you're seeing these independent political rulers, princes and kings, gaining power that used to belong to the Pope. They're breaking away from the church's authority. And political borders now determine your religious identity, right? If you are from Poland, you're going to be Catholic. If you're in this area of the Holy Roman Empire, you are going to be Lutheran. If you're over here in the Swiss Confederation, you're probably going to be Calvinist. If you're over here in England, you're going to become an Anglican. We'll get to them in a minute, right? Another version of Christianity. So your political borders, where you physically live, is going to determine your religion for you. The ruler is going to tell you what type of religion you need to practice. And you can see how that kind of is going to weaken some things when it's religious belief that justifies your control, and now you're telling them what their religious belief has to be. Europe's no longer unified under a single version of Christianity, and things are about to get really messy. Speaking of England, over there on the British Isles, a king known as Henry VIII from the Tudor family wants his marriage annulled, right? He's married, his wife isn't having any sons, he needs sons to carry on the family line because the son's going to be the next king, and his wife's not having kids. So he wants the marriage annulled or declared invalid so that he can get married again, because in Catholicism, you can't get divorced. Once you're married, you are married forever, unless the Pope says, mulligan, whoopsie, you should never have been married in the first place because of one reason or another. And the Pope says, no, Henry, there's no reason for me to invalidate your marriage. You have to stay married to this woman that's not giving you any sons. And the king's like, well, you sure about that? Because this whole Reformation thing going on over in the Holy Roman Empire sounds like a good idea to me. Henry goes to Parliament, those nobles who got together we talked about with Magna Carta and all that. So he goes to the collection of nobles in Parliament and he says, hey, how about we challenge the authority of the Pope? How about we break away and we create our own version of Christianity in order to bring power over here away from Rome toward England so we can have our own control over religious faith over here. And Parliament goes, yeah, that's a good idea. And they pass this thing called the Act of Supremacy, which makes Henry not just the King of England, but the head of the Church of England, which is Christian. It's also referred to as the Anglican Church, but instead of the Pope being in charge of the religion, the King is now in charge of the religion. So he serves as the political and religious ruler of all the people of England. Now, it's important here we contrast these two Reformation leaders, Henry VIII and Martin Luther. Luther breaks away from the Catholic Church for a theological reform. That is, he believes that the Christian faith is not being taught, organized, and worshiped properly by the Pope, and that's why they break away. Henry breaks away over here for political power, not religious reasons. Luther, right over here, fragments religious authority and starts to shatter into all these different versions, whereas Henry does it to centralize more power of the government into his hands. So authority is relocating in both of these instances. It's not disappearing. But you need to know the difference between why Henry did this and why Luther did this. So Luther, spiritual reasons, disagreements over the religious system. Henry, he did it because he wanted more power and he wanted a divorce, essentially. The problem is now the religion of England is tied to the crown of England, the king, and after Henry dies, religion begins to shift back and forth depending on who is the monarch, who is the king or queen. When Edward VI becomes king, he pushes for further Protestant reforms in order to get rid of even more Catholic kind of hanging-ons in the faith to make it more distinct from Catholicism, but still Christian. Mary I becomes Queen of England, right? There is no king, she's the queen, and she is a devout Catholic and decides to make everyone Catholic again in England. Then Elizabeth I becomes queen, and she restores Protestantism, and the Anglican faith, the Church of England, becomes a thing again. So it's kind of like a ping-pong game. Depending on who's in charge and what their personal religious beliefs are, well, that's going to change your religious beliefs. And if you don't, the government's going to punish you for it. So do what we say. Parliament is also going to play a key role in shaping religious policy at this time because the nobles in Parliament are gaining more and more power, and they're going to start saying, we're not voting on taxes, we want to say in the changes of the Anglican faith, because Henry, you're saying that we should be different from Catholicism, we agree, and because we're the nobles and we want some power, we're going to tell you what those changes are going to be. This is going to lead to civil war in England. We'll get there next unit. So now we have kind of a new structural reality that the people of England are facing. Religion is depending on who's sitting on the throne and their own personal religious beliefs and what suits them best. The subjects are forced to change their religion back and forth depending on who is sitting on that throne. And this creates kind of a religious whiplash, right? You're Anglican, Catholic. It really depends on who's on that throne. And this tension between monarchy and the parliament begins to deepen as the nobles are like, no, we want to do one thing, and the kings say, no, we want to do another. And that's going to lead to tension within England itself between these two power sources. So religious fragmentation becomes political instability. But wait, there's more, because over here in Geneva, in the Swiss Confederation, which is kind of technically part of the Holy Roman Empire, it's complicated. We're not getting there. We're not going to go there. There's this guy known as John Calvin, and he's reading the ideas of Luther, and he's like, yeah, I agree with a lot of your things, and a lot of your interpretations of the Bible, but whereas Luther says, right, salvation, going to heaven is based on your faith and faith alone, John Calvin's like, well, let's think about this logically. Let's explore these ideas. And if God is all-knowing, then he must know if you're going to heaven or hell before you're even born, before you even do anything. You have no free will. Essentially, what happens to you after you die was determined before you were born, and this idea called predestination. So he's like, if God's all-knowing, then he must know this ahead of time. Otherwise, he's not all-knowing. And he starts to put other changes and ideas into practice and creates a model Protestant city in the city of Geneva, where basically there's a strict moral code enforced, so everyone has to act the exact same way based on Calvin's religious beliefs. Reforms are starting to spread through organized communities as more and more people are buying into his ideas about God and Christianity. And belief becomes part of your structured identity, who you see yourself as. And this reform movement that Luther starts to harden and expand and also fracture into all these different little segments. And again, Lutherans are like, you guys are crazy. We don't like you. This is not the right way to interpret the Bible. And Catholics are like, yeah, you're crazy. That's not the right way to interpret the Bible. And so Lutherans and Catholics both hate Calvinists. And it's, again, I keep saying it, it's exhausting. Everyone seems to have their own opinion on what the Bible means. And this fragmentation starts to spiral out of control. Protestants start to argue that the Bible is the only authority. Individuals must interpret Scripture differently and for themselves, which means new groups are going to form over disagreements over how to interpret the Bible. And those disagreements are going to lead to, well, a lot of violence. Heck, another group shows up called the Anabaptists, and they're like, hey, one big thing we got a complaint with is that if you're going to be saved, it has to be something you actively choose for yourself. And part of the Christian faith says you have to be baptized. And there, all these other Christian groups are saying you should baptize babies when they're born so they can go to heaven. But Anabaptists are like, how, babies have to choose it for themselves, so or can't make a choice. So baptism should only be adults and not babies. And Catholics are like, well, that's crazy because well then they're not going to heaven, and they're all fighting over this, right? The Anabaptists also argue that hey, maybe we should, you Calvinists who are really, you Anglicans who are really mixing government and religion together, maybe we shouldn't be doing that. And everyone else starts shouting at them. Catholics, Protestants, they both go with the Anabaptists and think they're crazy, and they start, well, killing them, right? So authority is becoming very decentralized, and this splintering just keeps accelerating because if now everyone can interpret the Bible for themselves, they're going to start interpreting the Bible and religion for themselves. So now we get to 1560. Europe is divided, deeply divided politically and religiously. Northern Europe is largely Protestant, Southern Europe is largely Catholic. Some regions are deeply mixed. The borders of territories are increasingly aligning with which religious belief system. And again, they're all Christian, but which version of Christianity you're following. And religion now defines political geography. And that's kind of the state of the world in 1560, right? This is only, 50 years ish since Martin Luther nailed that thing to the door of the church, and you see how much havoc has been wrought by that one act. So the structural vulnerability is really showing itself here, right? Authority is no longer centralized in Rome. People are free to interpret things for themselves. Religion and political power are now linked differently in each region, and that's going to have its own problems. Some systems are going to strengthen the power of monarchs, like the Anglican Church. Some are going to empower territorial rulers, like you saw within the Holy Roman Empire with the Peace of Augsburg. And some are going to require or demand that religion and government be separated from each other, like the Anabaptists, which is, of course, going to lead to political and religious leaders persecuting them for this. Because if you challenge authority, authority is going to swing back. So now Europe is deeply divided both theologically, based on the religious beliefs, and politically, as in who is the ruler. And religious fragmentation becomes political fragmentation, and religious disagreement becomes political conflict. So you're going to see some wars coming out of this. What we're going to see next is we're going to see, okay, the Catholic Church, how are they going to react to this challenge to authority? That's what we're going to focus on in class in our next lesson. All right, I realize this was a little longer than the previous one, but it's about in line with our usual length of about 18, 19 minutes. Try to keep it less than 20. Rewrite the goal, identify those 3 facts, write it out, and write that one question. Show me your thinking. Show me you're integrating this knowledge into the narrative. Ask whatever questions you want about history from these topics to help explore it further. Until then, we'll see you next class.